The marble corridors of the Palazzo Ducale echoed with whispered conspiracies and calculated betrayals. In the heart of Renaissance Italy, where power shifted like sand in an hourglass, Niccolò Machiavelli walked among princes and paupers alike, observing the intricate dance of human ambition and emotional manipulation. What he witnessed would fundamentally challenge everything the world believed about strength, vulnerability, and true sovereignty. The morning sun cast long shadows across the courtyard as Lorenzo de' Medici received news that would have broken lesser men. His closest advisor, Francesco Pazzi, had been discovered orchestrating a plot not just against his life, but against his very soul. The conspiracy was elaborate in its psychological sophistication, designed not merely to kill Lorenzo, but to destroy him emotionally first. They had planned to use his love for his brother Giuliano against him, his pride in his family legacy as a weapon of self-destruction, and his fear of betraying Florence's trust as chains to bind his judgment. Yet Lorenzo's response defied every expectation of how a man should react to such devastating treachery. Rather than rage or despair, he felt something far more unsettling to his enemies, a profound sense of liberation. The revelation that his emotions had been studied, mapped, and weaponized against him didn't diminish his power, it amplified it exponentially. For in that moment of recognition, Lorenzo understood what Machiavelli would later articulate as the ultimate paradox of power: when you fully comprehend how your emotions can be used against you, they cease to be vulnerabilities and transform into your greatest weapons. This transformation represents the first principle of emotional sovereignty, the recognition that emotions, far from being weaknesses to be suppressed or manipulated, are sources of immense power when properly understood and directed. Lorenzo's enemies had made the fatal error of assuming that emotional awareness meant emotional weakness. They failed to grasp that a man who knows his emotional landscape intimately is infinitely more dangerous than one who pretends emotions don't exist. The art of emotional weaponization begins with the profound understanding that every human being carries within them a complex ecosystem of fears, desires, loyalties, and dreams. These are not character flaws to be exploited by others, but rather the raw materials from which true strength is forged. When Lorenzo learned that Francesco had spent months studying his reactions to his brother's illness, mapping how protective instincts could override strategic thinking, he didn't feel violated, he felt enlightened. The enemy had inadvertently provided him with a complete manual for his own emotional mechanics. This revelation led to what historians would later call the Medici Reformation, not a religious movement, but a complete reimagining of how power operates when emotions are consciously integrated rather than unconsciously manipulated. Lorenzo began to deliberately expose his emotional triggers to trusted advisors, not to eliminate them, but to understand their full spectrum of possibilities. When he felt anger, he learned to trace it to its source and ask what it was protecting. When fear arose, he examined what it was attempting to preserve. When love motivated him, he explored how it could be channeled into strategic advantage rather than blind loyalty. The transformation was so complete that his enemies found themselves in the peculiar position of having prepared weapons that no longer had targets. Francesco's careful psychological profiles became obsolete overnight, not because Lorenzo had changed his fundamental nature, but because he had consciously embraced it. A man who knows he loves deeply and plans accordingly cannot be manipulated through that love. A leader who acknowledges his pride and incorporates it into his decision-making process cannot be undone by appeals to vanity. A ruler who understands his fears and prepares contingencies cannot be paralyzed by threats to what he holds dear. The second principle of emotional sovereignty emerged from Lorenzo's subsequent interactions with neighboring city-states. Traditional diplomacy relied heavily on reading and manipulating the emotional undercurrents of negotiations. Ambassadors were trained to identify whether their counterparts were driven by greed, fear, honor, or revenge, then craft their proposals to exploit these motivations. Lorenzo revolutionized this entire system by doing something unprecedented. He made his emotional motivations completely transparent. When the Venetian ambassador arrived expecting to engage in the typical dance of hidden agendas and emotional manipulation, Lorenzo met him in a way that defied every diplomatic convention. He began the negotiations by openly stating his emotional stakes in the proposed trade agreement. He explained that he felt genuine affection for Venice based on childhood memories of his father's stories, acknowledged his fear that a poor agreement might damage his reputation among Florentine merchants, and admitted his excitement about the possibility of creating something beneficial for both cities. This radical transparency created a phenomenon that negotiation experts would study for centuries. The Venetian ambassador, stripped of his primary tools of emotional manipulation, found himself responding with equal honesty. The negotiation became not a battle of hidden psychological warfare, but a collaborative engineering of an agreement that acknowledged and incorporated everyone's emotional reality. The resulting treaty was not only more favorable to both parties than anyone had expected, but it created a template for what became known as sovereign diplomacy, negotiations conducted between emotionally integrated leaders who used their feelings as sources of clarity rather than vulnerability. This approach proved so effective that within 2 years, Lorenzo was receiving delegations from across Europe specifically to learn what they called the Florentine method. Kings and princes who had spent their entire lives learning to hide their emotions found themselves studying how to consciously weaponize them. The irony was not lost on Machiavelli, who observed that the most powerful political tool of the age was not deception or manipulation, but radical emotional honesty. The third and most revolutionary principle emerged from Lorenzo's approach to handling internal dissent within Florence. Traditional rulers dealt with opposition through a combination of force, bribery, and psychological intimidation. They sought to break the will of their opponents by attacking their emotional foundations, threatening their families, undermining their reputations, or isolating them from their sources of emotional support. Lorenzo pioneered an entirely different approach that would later be called emotional Aikido, using the opponent's emotional energy against itself, not through manipulation, but through conscious redirection. When the wool merchants began organizing against his latest tax proposals, instead of meeting their anger with counter-anger or their fear with threats, Lorenzo did something unprecedented. He invited their leader, Antonio Salvetti, to a private dinner and spent the entire evening helping him articulate exactly why he was angry and what he was afraid of. Lorenzo listened with the intensity of a scholar studying a fascinating text, asking clarifying questions and taking detailed notes. By the end of the evening, Antonio found himself in the bizarre position of having had his emotional reality completely witnessed and validated by the very person he was fighting against. This wasn't a manipulation tactic. Lorenzo genuinely understood that Antonio's anger came from a deep love for his workers and fear that increased taxes would force him to reduce wages. The fear was rooted in childhood memories of his own father's struggles during an economic downturn. Lorenzo's questions helped Antonio see that his emotional reaction, while completely valid, was based on assumptions about the tax proposal that weren't accurate. More importantly, Lorenzo was able to articulate how his own emotional investment in Florence's prosperity was actually aligned with Antonio's concerns. The result was something that political scientists struggle to categorize even today. Antonio didn't switch sides or abandon his principles. Instead, he and Lorenzo collaborated to redesign the tax proposal in a way that achieved Lorenzo's revenue goals while addressing Antonio's underlying emotional concerns. The wool merchants went from being opponents to being active partners in implementation. The emotional energy that had been directed toward conflict was redirected toward creative problem solving. This pattern repeated itself across dozens of similar situations. Lorenzo discovered that when he approached opposition with genuine curiosity about the emotional drivers behind it, the opposition usually transformed into collaboration. His opponents found it nearly impossible to maintain adversarial positions against someone who was actively helping them understand and articulate their own motivations. The emotional weaponization flowed in both directions. Lorenzo's curiosity and empathy became tools that dissolved resistance, while his opponent's passion and concern became resources for developing better solutions. The implications of these discoveries extended far beyond politics. Lorenzo began applying the same principles to economic negotiations, military strategy, and even artistic patronage. When commissioning works from temperamental artists, instead of managing their egos through flattery or intimidation, he would spend time understanding the emotional landscape that drove their creativity. This led to artistic collaborations that produced works of unprecedented depth and power, because the artists felt emotionally understood rather than emotionally managed. The military applications were perhaps most surprising. Traditional warfare relied heavily on psychological tactics designed to break the enemy's morale through fear, despair, or rage. Lorenzo pioneered what military historians call emotional intelligence warfare, strategies that acknowledged and worked with the emotional reality of both his own forces and his opponents. Before the Battle of Poggio Imperiale, instead of giving his troops a traditional rallying speech designed to inspire courage through shame or glory, Lorenzo spent the night before battle having honest conversations with his soldiers about their fears, their motivations for fighting, and their concerns about their families. This radical departure from military convention initially alarmed his commanders, who feared that acknowledging fear would undermine morale. Instead, the opposite occurred. Soldiers who felt their emotional reality had been witnessed and validated fought with a fierce determination that surprised everyone, including themselves. They weren't fighting to prove they weren't afraid, they were fighting as men who knew exactly what they were afraid of losing and had chosen to protect it anyway. The emotional clarity created a form of courage that was more sustainable and effective than traditional battlefield inspiration. Similarly, Lorenzo revolutionized intelligence gathering by training his agents not in deception and manipulation, but in emotional recognition and authentic connection. Instead of trying to trick enemy agents into revealing information, his intelligence network focused on creating genuine relationships where information flowed naturally from mutual understanding and shared emotional investment. Enemy agents often found themselves voluntarily sharing intelligence with Lorenzo's people, not because they were betraying their cause, but because the conversation had helped them understand that their true emotional goals were better served by cooperation than conflict. The sophistication of this approach became evident in Lorenzo's handling of the papal conspiracy. Pope Sixtus IV had orchestrated an elaborate plot involving emotional manipulation on multiple levels. The conspiracy was designed to exploit Lorenzo's pride through public humiliation, his loyalty through threats to his family, his patriotism through attacks on Florentine institutions, and his faith through religious pressure. It was a masterpiece of psychological warfare that should have been devastating in its effectiveness. Lorenzo's response demonstrated the full maturation of emotional sovereignty. Rather than defending against each emotional attack separately, he recognized the entire conspiracy as an attempt to fragment his emotional integration. His counter-strategy was not to resist the emotional impacts, but to consciously embrace them and redirect their energy. He publicly acknowledged that the attacks on his pride were painful, that the threats to his family were terrifying, that the assault on Florence was infuriating, and that the religious pressure was spiritually troubling. This acknowledgement, rather than weakening his position, made him effectively unassailable. His enemies had prepared weapons designed to exploit emotional denial and unconsciousness. When faced with conscious emotional integration, their attacks lost their power to destabilize. Lorenzo's public admission of his emotional responses paradoxically demonstrated his complete mastery over them. A leader who could feel everything fully and still think clearly was a leader who could not be broken by emotional manipulation. The conspiracy collapsed not because Lorenzo defended against it successfully, but because he absorbed its emotional impact consciously and transformed it into strategic clarity. His pain became determination, his fear became careful planning, his anger became focused action, and his spiritual turmoil became deeper wisdom. The papal forces found themselves fighting not a defensive opponent who could be worn down emotionally, but a creative collaborator who used every attack as raw material for stronger strategy. This transformation represented the culmination of what Machiavelli observed as the ultimate paradox of power. The prince who tried to appear invulnerable while hiding his emotional reality was constantly at risk of having that reality discovered and exploited. The prince who consciously integrated his emotional reality and made it visible became genuinely invulnerable, not because he had no emotional triggers, but because his triggers had been transformed from vulnerabilities into sources of power. The long-term implications of Lorenzo's innovations extended far beyond his own rule. The principles he developed began spreading throughout Renaissance Europe, creating a new model of leadership that would influence political thought for centuries. Kings and princes who adopted emotional sovereignty found themselves not only more effective in their rule, but more satisfied in their personal lives. The integration of emotional reality with political strategy created leaders who were simultaneously more powerful and more human. The merchant classes were particularly receptive to these ideas, recognizing their applications in trade negotiations and business relationships. Emotional sovereignty became a competitive advantage in markets where traditional manipulation tactics were becoming less effective. Merchants who could acknowledge their own emotional stakes in negotiations while reading and respecting the emotional reality of their trading partners found themselves creating more profitable and sustainable business relationships. The artistic community embraced emotional weaponization as a creative methodology. Artists who learned to consciously engage with their emotional landscapes produced works of greater depth and power. The emotional honesty that Lorenzo had pioneered in politics became a driving force in what historians call the High Renaissance artistic revolution. Painters, sculptors, and architects who integrated emotional consciousness into their creative process produced works that spoke more directly to human experience than the emotionally defended art of previous generations. Religious leaders found themselves grappling with the theological implications of emotional sovereignty. Traditional Christian doctrine emphasized the mortification of emotions as spiritual discipline, but Lorenzo's example suggested that conscious emotional integration might be a more powerful path to spiritual development. Progressive theologians began developing what they called contemplative sovereignty, spiritual practices that embraced emotional reality as a source of divine connection rather than an obstacle to it. The educational implications were equally revolutionary. Universities began developing curricula that included emotional intelligence alongside traditional subjects. Students learned not just how to think clearly, but how to feel consciously and integrate emotional wisdom into intellectual analysis. This produced a generation of leaders, scholars, and artists who approached human challenges with unprecedented sophistication and effectiveness. Military academies incorporated emotional sovereignty into strategic training. Commanders learned to read not just the tactical situation, but the emotional landscape of both their own forces and enemy armies. This led to military strategies that were more effective and less destructive, as leaders could often achieve their objectives through emotional influence rather than purely physical force. Wars became shorter and less devastating as emotionally sovereign leaders found creative alternatives to prolonged conflict. The diplomatic corps across Europe underwent fundamental transformation. Traditional diplomatic training focused on deception, manipulation, and psychological advantage. The new diplomatic model emphasized emotional honesty, creative collaboration, and mutual understanding. International conflicts that had previously required years of complex maneuvering were often resolved in weeks through emotionally integrated negotiation. Perhaps most significantly, the concept of emotional sovereignty began influencing how individuals understood their personal relationships and life choices. Citizens who learned to recognize and consciously direct their emotional energy found themselves living more satisfying and effective lives. Marriage relationships became more intimate and stable as partners learned to weaponize their emotions in service of mutual flourishing rather than individual advantage. Parent-child relationships became more nurturing and effective as parents learned to acknowledge their own emotional stakes in their children's development. The economic implications were profound. Markets operated more efficiently when participants could acknowledge and integrate their emotional motivations rather than pretending to operate from purely rational calculations. Investment decisions became more successful when emotional factors were consciously included rather than unconsciously ignored. Trade relationships became more profitable and stable when all parties could acknowledge and work with their emotional reality. Social movements began adopting emotional sovereignty as an organizing principle. Instead of trying to motivate followers through manipulation of fear, anger, or shame, leaders learned to help people understand and consciously direct their emotional energy toward positive change. This produced social movements that were more effective and less destructive, creating lasting positive change rather than temporary emotional upheaval. The implications for governance were revolutionary. Traditional political power had relied heavily on the ability to manipulate public emotions through fear, pride, anger, or shame. Leaders who adopted emotional sovereignty found themselves able to create genuine collaboration with their citizens by acknowledging and working with the emotional reality of public concerns. This produced more effective governance and greater citizen satisfaction, as people felt genuinely heard and understood rather than manipulated or ignored. The justice system underwent fundamental examination. Traditional legal proceedings often became battles of emotional manipulation where lawyers tried to trigger specific emotional responses in judges and juries. Courts that adopted emotional sovereignty principles focused on understanding the emotional dimensions of conflicts and developing resolutions that addressed underlying emotional needs as well as legal requirements. This produced more satisfying outcomes and reduced repeat offenses, as people felt their fundamental concerns had been addressed rather than simply overruled. The medical community began recognizing the health implications of emotional sovereignty. Patients who learned to consciously integrate their emotional responses to illness recovered more quickly and completely. Medical practitioners who acknowledged and worked with their own emotional reactions to patients' suffering became more effective healers. The integration of emotional consciousness into medical practice produced treatments that addressed not just physical symptoms but the complete human experience of illness and healing. As Lorenzo aged and reflected on the transformation his life had undergone, he recognized that emotional sovereignty had given him something far more valuable than political power or personal success. It had given him the ability to live authentically without vulnerability, to love deeply without dependence, to fight fiercely without hatred, and to lead effectively without manipulation. These were not contradictions but rather the natural results of conscious emotional integration. The principles he had discovered continued to evolve and spread long after his death. Each generation found new applications and deeper understanding of how emotional consciousness could be weaponized in service of human flourishing. The basic insight remained constant: when emotions are fully understood and consciously directed, they cease to be vulnerabilities that others can exploit and become sources of power that no external force can diminish. Machiavelli's observation proved prophetic. In a world where emotional manipulation had become the primary tool of political control, the leader who achieved emotional sovereignty became genuinely uncontrollable. Not through emotional suppression or denial, but through conscious emotional integration and direction. When your emotions are weaponized in service of your own deepest values and highest purposes, no external force can use them against you. Instead, they become the foundation of a power that is simultaneously more effective and more humane than any authority based on fear, manipulation, or control. The legacy of Lorenzo's innovations extended far beyond politics into every domain of human experience. Emotional sovereignty became recognized not as a political strategy but as a fundamental human capacity, the ability to feel fully, understand clearly, and choose consciously how to direct emotional energy in service of authentic values and genuine connection. This transformation represented not just a new approach to power, but a new understanding of what it means to be human in a world where emotional manipulation had become the norm. The ultimate lesson of emotional sovereignty was not that emotions should be controlled or suppressed, but that they should be understood, embraced, and consciously directed. When this integration is achieved, emotions become not sources of vulnerability but fountains of wisdom, not weaknesses to be hidden but strengths to be celebrated, not forces to be feared but resources to be treasured. In such integration, true power is found, not the power to control others, but the power to remain free, authentic, and effective regardless of external circumstances or manipulations. This is the deepest meaning of Machiavelli's observation: when your emotions are weaponized in service of your own highest good, you become genuinely sovereign. Not because you are unfeeling, but because your feeling is conscious. Not because you are unaffected by the world, but because your responses are chosen rather than automatic. Not because you are invulnerable, but because your vulnerability has been transformed into strength. In such sovereignty, no external power can rule you, because you have learned to rule yourself not through suppression or control, but through understanding, integration, and conscious choice.